Hello and welcome to episode 82 of Foreign Correspondents, a podcast that brings you interviews with journalists around the world. I'm Jake Spring, a foreign correspondent with 12 years' experience in Brazil and China. For this episode, I spoke to Daniel Alvarenga, a freelance journalist and host of the podcast Humo, Murder and Silence in El Salvador from Sonora Media. This interview came about after Sonora reached out looking to publicize Humo's release a few months back. When I first read their email, I'll admit I was a bit skeptical. I had had a bad experience a couple years ago with a publicist from a certain publication. Without naming them, let's just say the publication rhymes with Paddington Roast. It was clear that the person had never listened to Foreign Correspondents, and it later proved that they were also incapable of actually arranging an interview with anybody at Paddington Roast. After that waste of time, I've pretty much only dealt directly with my guests when it comes to scheduling. So when Sonora reached out, I waited up and listened to the first episode of Humo, which is spelled Humo. It's Spanish for smoke. It's super legit, and needless to say, their production quality blows my little podcast out of the water. So I figured, what the heck? I guess I've got nothing to lose. Why not give it a try? And I'm really glad I did. It gave me a chance to speak to Daniel, a journalist who covers El Salvador, a country I'm not sure how I would have highlighted otherwise. In an ideal world, I would love to have episodes spotlighting all of the roughly 200 countries in the world. But that's easier said than done. Basically, it's difficult to highlight a lot of smaller countries where international publications don't have a full-time reporter, and often don't even have regularly published stringers. So just from Googling, it can be hard to suss out who is good that covers that country, especially if I know next to nothing about that country. Unless I happen to get lucky and find somebody through a personal connection, a friend of a friend, something like that. And besides that, sure, there are lots of local language journalists I can find. But again, unless I have a personal referral, it's hard to know if they speak English to the level that they can spin a narrative of their life off the top of their head for nearly 2 hours. And you can't exactly cold email people asking if they speak English. That's just awkward. Another challenge is also that I tend to have a rule that I only talk to people who are working full-time as journalists. No retirees, no moonlighters. So when Daniel said early in the interview he was working full-time in communications, it was like a big, is this interview going to work out? Well, I guess we're here. Let's roll with it. So I did. And I've now had some more time to think about it and realize that my purist attitude is perhaps not a full, fair reflection of the industry. The fact is, there are a lot of places like El Salvador where you'd be hard-pressed to pay the bills just by writing about it for an English-language audience. As we'll talk about with Daniel, it's a tough market. You also have mass layoffs that Daniel has gone through not long ago, as have hundreds of journalists in recent months. Not everyone has the luxury to wait for a journalism job to come along for their next paycheck. So if he's working in comms to pay the bills and freelancing about Central America, who am I to judge? Okay, enough about the process. On to the interview and Daniel himself. Daniel and I are very different types of journalists. Like there's a spectrum of journalists. On one end is publication like Reuters that are hardcore about objectivity. No opinion, no value judgments whatsoever. On the other end is opinion journalism, like the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. But there's a lot that sits in between that. Daniel definitely represents journalism that's a little bit more on the activist end, as in advocating for human rights and speaking out against authoritarianism, and just advocating for awareness about what's going on in Central America in general. I'm not saying one or the other is better, but I just know a lot more journalists who practice the objectivity-driven newspaper style of journalism. But Daniel's style also represents a huge swathe of the industry. The image of a crusading journalist out to prove a point is an image that exists for a reason. Anyway, listening back to the interview, I was struck by the different style and mentality that he approaches journalism with as compared to me. I imagine as I continue listening to Humo, that style will emerge further as we learn what this saga of mass murder says about El Salvador. We'll discuss more about the podcast, including its cool bilingual concept, later in the interview. You should go check it out wherever you get your podcasts. Again, the title is Humo, Murder and Silence in El Salvador. Now here's my interview with Daniel, a freelance journalist and the host of Humo. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Jake. It's an honor.
To warm up a little bit, if you could set the scene, just tell us a little bit about your current surroundings and where you are geographically also, and maybe a little bit about what your past week of work has been like.
I currently live in Washington, D.C. So I'm in my home office where I just work from home usually. And here in D.C., it's kind of a rainy day today, so it's a great day for a podcast. And I've been in the city for 5 years and I really enjoy it. One thing that a lot of people don't know about D.C. is that the biggest immigrant group in D.C. is people from El Salvador. So even though I didn't grow up here, I wasn't born here, I feel very at home in D.C. because just everywhere I go, I meet someone from El Salvador, start up a conversation. I've met people who are from my mother's village. And so it's something that a lot of people think about when they think about D.C. They think about the White House and the monuments. And it's a little piece of home now that I've been here 5 years. But my week has been, I've had work, hybrid schedule. I've been doing a lot of promotion for the podcast, Humo. So I've been going on podcasts like this one and promoting it and just getting the word out, getting people to listen. And then, just doing my day job in the nonprofit world. Do a lot of copy editing, and I'm doing a lot of communications work. If people aren't aware, there's been a big sort of journalist, I wouldn't say mass exodus, more like mass layoffs. And I was affected by those too when I was at Telemundo. And so that hasn't stopped me. I'm still out here in the community doing work.
So would you say, are you done being a journalist or what? Where do things stand there? Are you leaving it behind?
That's a question I ask myself all the time. I'm still open to opportunities. A lot of the work that I get, including this podcast, is because people come to me because they feel that I have a different perspective, an insider perspective to what's happening in Central America, El Salvador. That being said, I'm not actively pitching these days. I prefer the opportunities to come to me sometimes, just because I'll get into it later. But sometimes having to pitch the case of why a story from Central America matters can be irritating. But no, journalism isn't over for me, but I'm definitely in a transition period where I'm what is the next step? I don't think I'll ever stop doing journalism. There's never going to be, I think, enough stories on Central America, enough accurate coverage, in my opinion, that I'll always have my hat in the ring. But as it stands as a full-time employment right now, it's not something that I'm eager to jump into. I feel there's a lot of turmoil in newsrooms right now. There's a lot of, with the war and the genocide in Palestine, there's a lot of, I don't envy my journalist friends who are in newsrooms right now and having to have these really tough conversations with their newsroom. And, I came from Al Jazeera, and we had a very, very, very specific journalistic ethic towards this particular conflict. And in some ways, it kind of soured me for other newsrooms because I don't think I'll have a newsroom that is as direct about the occupation in Palestine. But right now I'm just, doing freelance opportunities on the side while I do my 9-to-5 job. And I'm open to work, but I'm also a lot more choosy than I used to be.
Sure. No, that makes sense. Okay, cool. Well, that's just to get a little bit of a sense of where you're at today, right at the beginning. And we'll get back to some of that stuff a little bit later in the interview. To start, to get into a bit of your biography, we like to talk about how people get to where they are today. And usually I like to start way back at the beginning to ask where you were born, a little bit about what growing up was like, and if anything planted the seed of interest in journalism early on for you.
Yeah. It almost seems cliche to say that the Salvadoran Civil War was the catalyst, but it was for not just me, but for a lot of Central American journalists from this era. But I was born in 1989, 3 years before the war ended in El Salvador, but my parents had already fled, my parents and siblings. So I always say that I'm a son of Salvadoran refugees, not because we got refugee status. In fact, the United States government denied refugee status to most Salvadorans, a really high percentage. But politically, they were fleeing a war. And I call them refugees because of that, whether they have that designation or not. And my siblings as well. My siblings were born in El Salvador, and they made the journey as minors at different ages. And so that informed me because I was born into an immigrant household in Los Angeles. And in California at the time, there was this Governor Pete Wilson who was always threatening to get rid of immigrants and like restrict their rights. And it was very Trumpian. It was early 90s. And so the context that I grew up in was just political. Like, you can't depoliticize a civil war like El Salvador and an immigrant experience. So, my family is very open, and they would talk about why they left. They would talk about how we got to where we are now. And one of those times that really solidified this sort of interest in El Salvador, because before it was a journalistic interest, it was like an interest about like what happened here, like why is my family in two countries. And in 1993, a year after the war ended, I was around 4 years old, and my mother took me to El Salvador. And it was very jarring because it's like the first time I had been outside the country, but she was very afraid that I was going to forget where I came from. And I was the only child allowed to travel. Like I said, my siblings, they came from El Salvador during the war. They didn't have the documentation that let them travel back and forth. And so being born here, I had this privilege. And my mother, as soon as she was able to travel to El Salvador, she took me with her, and she wanted me to meet family members I had never met before. And that's where I started developing early ties. But El Salvador in 1993 was less than a year after the Civil War. So our Civil War was 1980 through 1992. So the war ended in 92, and the war's ended. It's not as dangerous, but a war doesn't just end from one day to the next. There is a de-escalation period, and this was very much the de-escalation period post-war in El Salvador. So what that meant was that there were army guys everywhere. They were Salvadoran army folks, and I was a child, and I asked my mom, I was like, why is there so many G.I. Joes? Why is G.I. Joe everywhere? Because that was my point of reference for soldiers. And you can't really explain a war to a 4-year-old. So this experience just contrasted completely with life in Los Angeles County, and it just is forever in my mind. And I grew up and I realized what had just happened in El Salvador and why this reunification with my mother's family was so significant for her. But that kind of started the itch of why are we different? Why do we come from this area? Why can some of my family members visit El Salvador and others can't visit the United States? And I also had a lot of beautiful child memories there too, as well. And I think because of that privilege of being able to travel to El Salvador, and I didn't experience a lot of the trauma of the war and having to leave the country. So for me, that also just started a curiosity in me about what are we? Growing up in Southern California, it's very Latino and it's very Mexican historically because of the colonization of the Spanish and then Mexico, and then the United States came. So California also has just a large Mexican-American Chicano community. And so Salvadorans were new. We're the new kid on the block in the 80s and 90s. So there wasn't a whole lot of representation. And so I was wondering, how are we different from our neighbors? We speak Spanish, and a lot of them speak Spanish too, but it's not the same Spanish. And it was it started off as just this curiosity to be why are we why are we different?
I don't know if you said very specifically, but how exactly was your family affected by the Civil War? I mean, were they living in the capital, and what exactly was the situation with the violence?
Yeah, so they were living in the capital. They actually had decent jobs. Both my parents came from poverty, but my mother specifically, she lost 2 brothers in the war. She had 2 brothers who were part of the resistance against the dictatorship. It was before the war and the guerrillas really consolidated. I'm talking the 70s, and the war didn't kick off into the 80s, but she lost her brothers within the span of less than 2 years. From 1980 to 1982, she lost 2 brothers, and that was the start of the Civil War. And one of them, she was very close to Raul, and the other one, Rene. With Raul, he was a labor organizer, and he was a medical student at the University of El Salvador. And we've actually gone on a lot of fact-finding to find out his story because he had a pseudonym. He kept his life in the Salvadoran resistance to the government, let's call it, secret from my mother. My mother was a government worker. She had a lower-level job in the government, and she couldn't, like, be associated. It would be deadly if they found out that, like, her brother was branded this, like, socialist student leader that is a part of the bigger Salvadoran resistance to the fascism that was going on at the time. So she actually lost two siblings, and she had to change residencies and almost lead a double life. One of someone who has like this nice, respectable downtown job in San Salvador, but also like you're worried that you're going to be linked to your brother and that the state's going to come after you. So those were all huge motivating factors to leave El Salvador and go to the States. And my dad came from a family that was a little bit more sympathetic to the right, or they were more status quo people. And despite that, his village in Chalatenango, where my dad's from, was a hotspot for the war. So they had been internally displaced like years before the war started, because it was a pocket that was already like hot before everything went off. So they had left their respective villages in the rural parts of El Salvador to live in the city for opportunity. So there was this element of internal displacement, and then they're like, okay, I think we need to leave the country. This war is not going anywhere. And they were right. The war raged on for almost a decade after they left, and they left sometime in the early 80s. And, we grew up with stories of like, my mother obviously talking about how her brothers were disappeared, but even my dad, he didn't have anyone close by him killed in terms of immediate family, but he definitely had stories of when he had a classmate, and I guess that classmate never came back, and like society all around them in a state of war is kind of crumbling around you. And so they always told me these stories of like, there was a checkpoint and we were very scared that we would be killed at this checkpoint or something, or you just never knew what would happen in El Salvador, especially in the early 80s. There was this escalation, and led to the assassination of the religious leader of the country, Catholic Bishop Monsignor Romero. He's one of the few, if not only, Catholic figures that was like shot down during mass, and he was a big symbol of the resistance, and he's now a saint in the Vatican. A couple years ago, they made him a saint. So El Salvador just became unlivable for a lot of factors, and they set sights on Los Angeles because my father had already had some family members migrate to the LA area, and that's where we went to.
That's plenty of reason to leave, for sure. And okay, and then you went back, starting from as a young kid, and that kind of got you interested in El Salvador and where you come from and your culture, etc. So I guess where do things go from there? I mean, in school, do you get involved in journalism in school at some point, or when does that kick off for you?
Yes. So when I went to undergrad, I went to University of California in Santa Barbara, UCSB. And in UCSB, there was a student radio station where I got my start called KCSB FM, 91.9 FM, KCSB FM in Santa Barbara. And they were sort of like my home on campus those 4 years. I started off as like a music DJ. I played like punk rock music and like even Latin American music as well. And I just did my music thing. And I started learning about El Salvador more through like Latin American studies classes, but also student groups on campus. And I got a chance to travel to El Salvador in 2009. I traveled to El Salvador in 2009 for a presidential election. I was observing, and it was the first time that a leftist candidate would be democratically elected to El Salvador with the FMLN party. The FMLN stands for the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front. It was the name of the guerrillas during the war, and they became a legitimate political party after the war. And so I was just, for me, it was connecting all the dots with my parents, and there was this thing happening. So I would go to El Salvador and get involved, and I would come to the radio station and tell like whoever was at the radio station, was like, oh, I went on this trip to El Salvador and this is what I learned. And the news person Kathy Murillo, she was the news director at KCSB. She was like, you have a very interesting story, and we'd love to share what you saw in El Salvador and talk about what you've learned. And so they interviewed me, and she was like, you know what, you should tell more stories about El Salvador, Latin America, or you seem very passionate about it. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, you're right. And so then I became, I dropped the music DJing and I became a reporter for them and an intern reporter. And then eventually in my last year, I was a news director for the station, and I ran the whole news program there, the daily news program. And
oh, wow.
Ever since then, I've been doing some sort of journalism, whether it is on social media or whatever. But that was KCSB FM was what really converted me into a journalist. Community radio.
But yeah, it wasn't even like a college station. It was an actual commercial station. Is that right?
No, it was a college station. It was a community college station. It wasn't just only for college kids. If you lived in the Santa Barbara area, you could apply. Like, we had people. I was funny. It's funny because I though I worked as a student in that radio station, I worked with community members that were like way older than me sometimes, and a lot of them also influenced me as well. And it was very much a community radio station, but ran through the campus, and I think paid through by student fees. But the mission was bigger than the campus, for sure.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. And what did you major in, out of curiosity?
Linguistics. Kind of random in terms of like, it wasn't like journalism, it wasn't media studies. Those majors were like really hard to get into for some reason. So I kind of found linguistics. I think it was helpful for me growing up bilingual. It really gave me a lot of tools to parse out the different kinds of dialects and languages. So like, for example, in El Salvador, we speak one dialect of Spanish, one version of it. And it's, slang that's very just native to El Salvador. And then growing up in LA, a lot of different Latino ethnicities, mainly having to learn like Mexican slang and things like that, and, talking to neighbors. And so it kind of helped my reporting because it really helped me think about like, oh, wow, Latin Americans, we all have different varieties of language. And just because I know El Salvador or I know Mexican Spanish doesn't mean that I can necessarily understand another type of Spanish like as intuitively. And so for me, that ended up kind of informing my journalism, but I wasn't a linguist. I didn't pursue linguistics. I just kind of wanted to study language. I ended up also learning Portuguese through the linguistics degree, which was great because I got to travel to Brazil and study abroad, but my focus was also Latin America, so, Portuguese made sense. But yeah, it was linguistics, and it was just, I wanted to study something that would just, help me grow, and that to me seemed like the most interesting thing at the time was language and language acquisition as well, because though I grew up bilingually, like I didn't grow up like a perfect bilingual. There were years where English dominated because of the school system, and so I had to relearn a lot of Spanish, or it wasn't until like I gained a lot of like linguistic knowledge in Spanish that I could have like really adult conversations with my parents. There was somewhat of a language barrier because I'm the younger child, and my siblings, they grew up speaking Spanish first in the home country. I would have to need my siblings to translate for me to speak to my parents sometimes, especially if it's like a more of a complex subject outside of like, I'm hungry, or like, turn off the TV. And it's something in my reporting that helps me, keep a linguistic justice component in terms of like, we don't all speak major languages, especially when I'm thinking of Central America. There's so much care that needs to happen in terms of uplifting indigenous languages. And though I don't speak one myself, a lot of my work as a reporter who talks about Central America is also talking about the linguistic diversity and how that impacts things like immigration court or just human rights generally. And I don't use the linguistics degree super directly, but yeah, it informs a lot of what I do.
Cool. And so you graduate from college, and then what happens after that?
Oh my. So I graduated into the recession. So
What year are we talking?
we're talking 2011. It's not like, everyone thinks the recession was like 2008 and that's it. Like, it lingered, and it was definitely lingering in 2011. So I managed to get a sort of internship at GLAAD, which was known as the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation. And I got to do some really cool work with GLAAD for like 6 months, but it was only an internship or a fellowship. It was very limited. It was full-time employment coming out of college in 2011 was hard. We were deep into our Occupy Wall Street movement. And as a child of immigrants, I was like, I need a job. I need to pay back this college degree. And as the only American born and person who went to college in my immediate family, like, there was a lot of pressure on me to get a job. So I had a bunch of little odd jobs that didn't really pay much in those first 2 years, except for I got kind of desperate because I was promised this American dream, and like I jumped all the hoops. I went to college and I can't get a job, so instead of the American dream, I opted for the Korean dream, and I went to go teach English in Korea for a while.
Oh wow.
And that was my first big boy job, my first big boy apartment, my first getting any kind of income as an adult was full-time income was through teaching abroad in Korea for a while. And then from there I came back to the United States, and the economy was sort of recovering, I guess. I don't know if it truly recovered, but I was able to find jobs better when I came back from Korea. I don't know if it's because I had Korea in my resume, and so that was impressive to employers. I didn't do teaching after that. I went straight into communication. I was working for a healthcare provider at the time. There was like open enrollment, like Obamacare was new, and there was all these jobs to promote the Affordable Care Act to especially Hispanic communities and help navigate through the language barriers. So I did a little bit of that until I got back into journalism, which happened at Al Jazeera.
Yeah, how did you end up at Al Jazeera?
I had this journalistic training in college, and I had this passion for Central America. And I was also really annoyed that a lot of people were speaking about Central Americans during the Obama era who weren't Central American. For example, in 2014, there was, people forget, there was a migrant crisis in 2014, an unaccompanied child crisis. And they had the kids in the aluminum-looking Mylar blankets, and they had sort of the kids in cages aesthetic. A lot of that stuff came from the Obama era, even though we associate it with the Trump era. And I was just really annoyed because people were like, where are all these Central Americans coming from? Central Americans are coming in droves, like unaccompanied. Why is this happening? There was a lot of what I say was people are just forgetting that we've been coming here since at least the 80s, at least from El Salvador's perspective. We've had quite regular migration to the United States since the 1980s. Like, this hasn't stopped since the war. And someone from my community can tell you why we keep coming, because when someone comes from Central America, not just El Salvador, they come into our communities and we're helping these people, whether, to find a job or find a place to live. And so much of like the 90s and the 2000s for me is like, once we became the established like immigrant family members, we are welcoming others and making sure other people feel welcomed and, get on their feet. And so throughout my life, I always saw a new family member pop up like, oh, they just came from El Salvador and they need a job and they have 2 kids and, and we got to enroll the kids at your school and things like that. And so when 2014 came around, I was like super annoyed with the fact that like this is our everyday, like people are coming into our communities from our home countries all the time. This isn't just started now. And so I was determined to be a voice and give my piece, my perspective as someone who grew up in these immigrant communities. And I was just yelling into the void on Twitter. And, I think a lot of journalists around this time really kind of through discourse and news trending topics became, built their careers from Twitter. And so I was just yelling into the void and sharing articles that I agreed with and that I thought were insightful. And I started cultivating an audience for Central American news. And so when this opportunity from Al Jazeera came, they wanted a social media manager. They did not want a reporter. They wanted someone who could schedule social media posts for them, write copy for social media. And I did that at my jobs. Like I said, I was working at healthcare provider for the ACA, doing a lot of social media marketing. And I also did a online degree in corporate communications because I was so desperate for a job that I thought that, coming into the recession, I was like, I need to make myself as employable as possible. Let me do something like marketing. There's more money in marketing than there is probably journalism. So it's like, that's always been my fallback. And especially as a child of immigrants, I'm like, I need to think of a plan B. But luckily the stars kind of aligned and I was just like, okay, I can use my digital marketing, social media experience to get in at AJ Plus, the digital millennial young Al Jazeera. Like AJ Plus even had a comedy show for a while. A lot of people, it's called News Broke with Francesca Fiorentini. She's great. And a lot of people don't think of Al Jazeera as humorous, and especially now. But, AJ Plus was this new experiment and I just really wanted to get in. And I was just happily just scheduling everyone's stories. And then at some point, the Trump Kids in Cages moment happened. And I can speak about it a little bit more in detail later. But people are like, whoa. They see on my Twitter, they see my opinions. They're like, whoa, this person knows a lot about what's going on with the immigrants that are in the headlines right now. And so after a while, people started tapping my shoulder and being like, hey, can you read the script? Can you give us some notes? Can you give us some feedback? And I always say that, like, I was never intended to be a reporter for Al Jazeera, and I kind of came in through the back door. There was a lot of resistance just because newsrooms are cutthroat. It's not just like an Al Jazeera thing. It's just newsrooms are very competitive and people work really hard for their stories, and there's a lot of egos. And so, I kept my head down, and when I had an opportunity to report on Central America, I took it. And since then, I built my portfolio, and I got to do a lot of on-screen videos, and I produced a lot more in the background. And I ended up producing videos that had millions of views, and Palestinian Salvadoran story. Like, that's the only outlet that would let me do a story on the history of Palestinian Salvadorans. Long story short is that Palestinians have been in El Salvador for 100 years, since the Ottoman Empire, and we've had 2 presidents of Palestinian descent in El Salvador, including the current one. And so I was just at the perfect place at the right time, and I got to create some really cool content while I was at AJ Plus. And since then, I've worked in journalism in some form. I went on to Telemundo.
I guess just to hang with Al Jazeera for a moment, how long were you there for? How many years? And just give us a couple of highlights of stuff you worked on there.
Yeah, I was there for over 3 years. And so I started in 2017 and left around the big burnout of 2020. But I got to do a lot of stories that centered around Central America. I got to cover water issues in El Salvador. I did a mini doc about water scarcity in El Salvador. El Salvador is stated to not have like drinkable water in like 80 years. It's a real bad emergency. And so I got to do stories like that. I got to do a lot of stories on Central America during the Kids on Cages time. So there's a lot of opportunity where I got to interview people who are Central American and to get their takes. And a lot of the times people don't come to our community to like ask them for their opinion. They're like, okay, here's our foreign correspondent. He like parachuted into the region yesterday and he's going to give you a rundown. So for me, I actually got to do a piece that asked Central Americans, like, who can talk about, like, my family came because of U.S. intervention in Central America. And like a lot of mainstream media places don't like to mention that a lot of the conflict in Central America was kind of stoked by Reagan. So it was kind of exhilarating. I also got to work with a lot of like not stock images, but we had a lot of access to news agencies. So if I saw something happening in Honduras or El Salvador or Guatemala, I would go on AP or Reuters and like pick it out and I would like pitch it and it's like, hey, like, let's use some of these images to illustrate what's happening at the border and what are some of the root causes of migration. And so Latin America isn't like the focus of a lot of reporting in Al Jazeera, but because they're overseas, they have like a very unique editorial lens, and so they're not afraid to critique the United States government. And I feel like a lot of places that I've been to don't give you as much room to do that. And so I was very grateful that I could basically talk about Central America. When there'd be an anniversary, like I mentioned Oscar Romero, He was the archbishop that was shot down at the beginning of the Salvadoran Civil War. It was like our who shot JFK moment in El Salvador. And it was one of the things that was a catalyst for the war to escalate. And so when his anniversary came around, I got to do a piece, and I got to do a lot of little micro 1 minute, 2 minute pieces that really reflected Central American politics and culture. But I also got to do larger pieces. Like I mentioned, my Palestinian Salvadorans mini doc. I did a piece with the Mayan League, and I work with them now in a different capacity. But originally I wanted to report on why there were so many indigenous children dying at the border. During the Trump Kids in Cages era, there was children like Jacqueline Gal and others who died in custody. And why were so many indigenous children who didn't speak Spanish or English dying at U.S. custody? Partially was the language barrier. So if one of these children was ill, like there was nobody in their native Mayan language to help them, or they just didn't care. And so I talked to the Mayan League, and we did a documentary that talked about why are so many children dying at the border. And they went back 500 years, and they're like, well, going from the Spanish invasion to the Civil War in Central America, Guatemala had a really bad civil war, the longest civil war in Central America, and it was a textbook case of indigenous genocide. And so we got to talk about that, and we got to talk about these kids who died at the border. It didn't just start with Trump. It didn't just start with this year, that year, 2019. Like there's a history of forced displacement that goes back 500 years and also goes back 30 years, 40 years to the intervention. And a lot of people like to bring up the Guatemalan coup, right? The whole Chiquita Banana, United Fruit Company coup. So Guatemala is such an important, and the stories of indigenous people in Guatemala, which they're a majority in that country, is so underlooked in the U.S. And to me, that was one of the most gratifying pieces to do, because it's also just started a really fruitful relationship with the Mayan League, and we collaborate on some very important things that I can get into later. But Al Jazeera really established me as I'm a journalist with a stake in Central America, and I don't see too many. I see more now than I did then. But yeah, it came from a place of let me set the record straight on Central America.
That's great, finding a backdoor in through social media and everything. I mean, I remember how tough things were. I graduated in 2009, and how difficult it was to get your foot in the door anywhere. So so yeah, definitely, however necessary, you had to make it happen. So do you go from Al Jazeera then to, was it Telemundo?
Telemundo.
Yeah. Do you go straight from one to the other?
Yes.
And how does that go down? How do you make the move?
So, Al Jazeera does amazing work, but it's such a stressful environment, and it was the pandemic. I had lugged my iMac, my work iMac, back home, and I was working from home, and the news cycle in 2020 was just, it was COVID, it was George Floyd, it was unrest, it was a lot of death. And so I wanted to take a break from the daily news grind, and instead of producing a breaking news story every day or a couple every day, I wanted to work on something that had a different pace. And so Telemundo had this new show. Telemundo is a Spanish language broadcaster, for those who aren't familiar, but this was something different. This was an English language show for Telemundo, and it had a social justice bent. And Telemundo, for those who are Latino in the United States to speak Spanish, Telemundo isn't known for its progressive bent. It's centrist at best, and it can lean right-wing more often than not. And so this sort of initiative coming out of 2020 to do a more progressive show for Latinos was like, oh, let me do that. It didn't exactly pan out that way, but it was called Radar 2020, and then it went on for 2 years until Radar 2022. And I got to do some cool stories there. I interviewed the nephew of Berta Cáceres. Berta Cáceres was an indigenous Lenca water defender who was killed by the Honduran dictatorship, let's call it. And she called out Hillary Clinton's involvement in the Honduran coup. And she says that if I die, you can blame the coup that Hillary Clinton did during the time that she was Secretary of State for Obama and she was doing foreign policy. And so I never in my life thought I would do like a pro-indigenous rights story for Telemundo. But I got to do a lot of stuff there. We did a lot of stuff around the election, the Latino vote. It was very Hispanic-centered, but I think a lot of this social justice, DEI, and like programming became a little passé. We didn't make our numbers. We weren't promoted. I think a lot of people didn't know we existed. So Telemundo had layoffs and like they canceled the show, and then I pivoted to other types of work, other types of communication work. But still, there's been opportunities since then. I did an article for Rolling Stone a couple years ago about Bitcoin in El Salvador. And
oh yeah, I almost forgot about that. Didn't they once talk about swapping out the currency for Bitcoin? I forgot that was El Salvador, right?
El Salvador is still the only country that Bitcoin is national currency, and it's as chaotic as it sounds. Like the everyday Salvadoran does not use Bitcoin, but if you're a foreigner who is already, let's say, in the Bitcoin world and you want a tourist destination, you can travel to El Salvador and use Bitcoin at Starbucks and McDonald's and select retailers, perhaps. They're building up these little resort colonies that accept Bitcoin. And so it didn't go over smoothly. It's unpopular. It's only popular with Bitcoin bros who parachute in for a tropical cryptocurrency vacation. So, but it's affecting the people of El Salvador. And it was one of President Bukele, he's the president of El Salvador, and he's very popular. This was one of his first unpopular measures. And it's still in the books. People still come to El Salvador for crypto tourism, whatever that looks like. But when I go to El Salvador and I ask people in the streets, like, hey, do you use crypto wallets? Do you use cryptocurrency? And they're like, no. If anything, they're afraid that they're going to lose that money. Because there's been a lot of fraud, really, where the president was like, okay, you need to use my crypto wallet, Chivo wallet. Chivo means cool in El Salvador slang. And he's like, download Chivo wallet and you'll get free $30 of cryptocurrency on them. And so like a lot of people signed up for this. And then a lot of people had their funds stolen. Like, you know, a lot of people like lied and said, oh, you know, they stole someone's identity to get the $30. Like, $30 in El Salvador is a lot. It could be more than a day's wage for some people. So it just created chaos. The country can't manage Bitcoin. El Salvador is, you know, it deals with a lot of infrastructure problems, and there's a lot of things to fix in El Salvador. Like I mentioned earlier, El Salvador has water scarcity issues. So how about let's fix that instead of adding this cryptocurrency thing. So that's just one of the rabbit holes that I've been in. I've been also reporting independently about just the Bukele regime, the new president. He's violating a lot of human rights, throwing a lot of people in jail. And it's very classic dictatorship, but a lot of people are loving it because they think he's cleaning up El Salvador, that he's putting the bad guys in prison. And I've had to go on a lot of alternative media. I've even gone on like Chinese TV and Al Jazeera. Even I've gone back to Al Jazeera to like speak about the Bukele regime because every day more and more people are like, hey, this guy, he seemed cool. He seemed like, you know, he wanted to bring El Salvador to the 21st century with Bitcoin, and I can't believe he's a bad guy or he's doing bad things. And that's where the podcast comes in. The podcast Humo, Murder and Silence in El Salvador, is a culmination of like me constantly yelling into the void on Twitter, like, hey, let's pay attention to what's really going on in El Salvador. And, you know, they liked me. They're like, okay, you're the kind of voice that we want on our podcast because you're critical of what's happening in El Salvador. Most people are like, he seems like a good guy. Let's see what he's doing. And I've always been in the team of like, you know, we need to question politicians whether they seem nice and friendly and cool or not. It would be a disservice also to like my elders who like suffered a dictatorship in El Salvador for me not to.
Yeah. So before we talk about the podcast, because I think the biography has basically caught us up to present, so we'll get to the talk about the podcast next. I guess just to talk a little bit about Bukele. I work for Reuters. I'm on these regional calls in Latin America. I've never reported on Central America, but I'm listen to the discussions, and Bukele really did turn things around with crime in kind of crazy way, in the sense that a lot of leaders talk about being tough on crime. A lot of leaders even probably run roughshod over human rights, but it's very rare for a country that was that racked by like gang violence, and that used to be the story. It was always stories about gangs that we would do in El Salvador, because that was just so dominant. And now it seems to have changed, and I understand the concerns over human rights and all that. And you see the pictures coming out of the prisons, and it looks pretty. I don't even know how to describe it, but it has made him very popular, and it has made even, I think, other countries kind of look and say, oh, maybe we should go this route. It actually seems to be working. So I guess I was just curious about that, and I don't know if you've been back to El Salvador much in this period. Just your thoughts on that, and is it really a different vibe there? Has gang violence and stuff really gotten under control?
Yeah, gang violence is under control, but now the monopoly of violence is from the state. So now it's state violence that we have to worry about. It went from one hand to the other. And I want to say this, because I'm always accused of oh, you're promoting gangsters in El Salvador, you're promoting MS-13. And I want to acknowledge that Salvadorans have been dealing with gang violence for a long time. It has been a big cause of why people migrate. I think people really wanted a relief for that. And I don't blame anyone for wanting a relief from the violence and the gang violence. And that desire for that relief is what has driven a lot of this PR for Bukele and has been manipulated. And violence has been going down in El Salvador. Violence has been going down in El Salvador since 2015, and it's been tapering off. Gang violence and the homicide rate has been tapering off when Bukele was getting to power. So Bukele was also taking a lot of credit for a lot of work that has already been done, because people didn't really see that work because the narrative never changed. The narrative of El Salvador has always been it's been at this baseline code red dangerous for 20 years because of gangs, and that wasn't always the truth. And so Nayib Bukele came at a time when gang violence is already kind of coming down, and then he started throwing just everybody in jail indiscriminately. Per capita, United States used to be the country with the most incarcerated people per capita. And there's been a lot of talk about the prison industrial complex in the United States and how there's been a lot of huge miscarriages of justice. El Salvador said, you know what, we're going to one-up you. And El Salvador under Nayib Bukele has now become the country with the most incarcerated population per capita. And it's partially because a lot of these people who are being arrested, some of them do have ties to criminal activity. Some of these people don't. We get into it in the podcast, but there's been very prominent gang leaders in El Salvador who have escaped imprisonment, who have been able to leave the jails. There's one guy called Crook who was driven to the Guatemalan border by one of Nayib Bukele's cabinet members, and he got to escape. And so really it's a system of if you're suspected of being a gangster or suspected of being a criminal, you get thrown in jail, and there's no due process. And so there's people have been sitting in Nayib Bukele's jail for over a year who have not seen their family members, who have not had legal counsel, who have not had a date in court. So I tell the people, if you want to lock up all the bad guys, quote unquote, shouldn't it be done in a way that is a little bit more fair, something that is a little bit more not just humane, but just follows some kind of legal protocol at all? And people in El Salvador don't care. A lot of people are just just throw them away, put away the keys. We've suffered under this, and we need a strong man to save us. And I think a lot of it is also us falling back into our own history. El Salvador's history as a nation has been, especially the modern history, has been mostly military dictatorships, except for the last couple of decades. The last post-war decades were like some of the first years of democracy in El Salvador. And so people have blamed that period, the post-war period, for the gangs. And it's a lot more complicated than that. Like, the United States started deporting more people to El Salvador. The gangs actually started in Los Angeles and then spread across the United States and Central America. So the gang problem is something that's actually born out of the criminalization system here in the United States. And so in 1996, President Clinton did a law called IRIRA, which is like, I call it the immigration sister to the crime bill. And basically it widened the criteria for deportation in 1996 and sent a lot of people back to war-torn Central America, like post-war Central America, unrecovered Central America. And these fragile democracies did not know how to handle these new bilingual, organized criminals. And so it's not just El Salvador's problem to solve as well. It's much more of like a regional hemispheric thing going on. Throwing people in jail also kind of absolves the U.S.'s role in this. So I feel like it makes a lot of people feel good that Nayib Bukele is handling the quote-unquote bad guys, and it's like a nice, neat little package. But when you talk to the people who are detained, a lot of them will say, I don't have ties to any criminal things. Like, I just was thrown in there because I'm an easy target. The people who are committing the crimes or who are killing people, like, they're watching their back. They know that they did something, they can get caught. They're a little bit harder to catch than an unsuspecting person who has not committed any crimes. They're not shying away from the law or anything because they have no reason to. And those are the people who get kind of swept up in this. People who don't have any recourse because they're poor, they come from working class neighborhoods, and they don't have someone in the government that can bail them out. And so they become a source of cheap labor, and then the whole country's cheering on the fact that they're being arrested. So it's like, in the president's eyes, it's all a win-win, but the international community has been sounding the alarm ever since those disturbing images came out from the prisons, where it's all these tattooed bald guys that like are semi-naked on the floor. It looks like some kind of concentration camp thing, but even those images feel very manipulative because MS-13 has like this image that's like very sensational. Trump used a lot of MS-13 tattooed bodied men images to bolster his policies, but the average person being arrested is not like a face tattooed person. It's like a 18-year-old boy who has no ties to criminal activity, probably is from a neighborhood that is impacted by some of this violence, but isn't a person themselves. But just because they're from a certain area code, no one's going to check for them. They're going to be like, oh, he's probably a gangster anyways. It's better that they be locked up than not. And so there's a movement in El Salvador called Movir, and it's a movement of the families of the victims who have been unjustly detained in El Salvador. And we go into it in the podcast, but it's something that hasn't really been explored by the mainstream press. Because if I turn on Telemundo or Univision, any of these Hispanic mainstream channels, they'll do a whole spread being like, look at Bukele's jails. The jails are state of the art. He's making everything safe. Go him. Wow. Crime is down. They're never going to interview the mother of a child who was arbitrarily detained, never saw court, and she hasn't seen in 2 years. Like, that's not the type of person that is being interviewed. It's just, they're little press packages, really, these little jail snippets that have gone viral.
Okay, yeah, so the next section we talk about a couple of specific pieces of work. The first one I like to start with is more something that got away, a story that got away from you. It's a story that you had wanted to do, but for whatever reason, you couldn't sell an editor on it. You couldn't keep people to talk to you. For whatever reason, it didn't come together.
Not a story specifically, but a general sort of
sure
area. So I mentioned this a little bit before, but before the kids in cages, before the Trump era of immigrant persecution, nobody was really checking for what was happening in Central America, especially under the Obama administration. And I was constantly trying to do stories on Honduras. Honduras was under a military dictatorship from like 2010. They had a coup and they had killed a lot of activists, including Berta Cáceres, an indigenous Lenca activist. She was trying to defend water and stop a dam from being built. I was like, we need to cover Honduras. We need to cover Honduras. Honduras is only 3 countries away from the U.S. It's a major source of asylum seekers, refugees, what have you. And we're not talking about it. And we're not talking about how the U.S. has like messed with its politics in recent times. And I say this because in 2010, El Salvador had its first democratically elected leftist president. And it felt like the region was turning a new leaf in 2010. Like, oh, okay, like maybe all of the death in the 80s weren't in vain. And then El Salvador, you know, it has its elections free and fair and everything looks like it's, you know, going well. And then next door, Honduras loses democracy. The president, Manuel Zelaya, who was popularly elected, gets pushed out. Then you had a series of leaders that repressed the people. Juan Orlando Hernandez was the president of Honduras one term after the coup, and he was notorious for suppressing activism, suppressing any sort of resistance to that dictatorship. And I would always be like, we can't talk about these unaccompanied children coming without talking about Honduras and Honduras. And that's the first time I was told there's no audience for a Honduras story. And I'm like, okay, like there's no audience for it. That doesn't mean that this isn't a important story that is affecting the United States and it's affecting people. And so there was a ton of stories I wanted to do on Honduras during that era that nobody really cared. Everyone was just like, Honduras, what's that? Like, why? What am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to bring up statistics about how many Honduran Americans exist? How do I prove to a newsroom? And this was a progressive newsroom. How do I produce to a newsroom that like stories about Honduras matter? Like the same repression that is happening in Honduras is linked to the repression that we see police in the United States. These police departments that are getting under fire right now for being linked to the IDF are also doing counterinsurgencies for gangs in countries in Central America. So I wanted to connect all these dots, but I guess the time wasn't opportune. And I say that because as soon as Trump starts putting a target on specifically people from shithole countries, which included Africa and the Caribbean and Central America for the most part, suddenly it shifted. Suddenly people cared about kids in cages. People were being outraged. Now that CNN was covering the kids in cages thing, okay, now we can talk about Honduras. Now we have an audience for Honduras. So when people tell me there's no audience for this, they were basically saying like Americans don't care. And so that was a big lesson for me too. Like it really kind of reiterated that like, oh man, we don't matter to some of these big mainstream outlets unless they feel like it directly impacts them and makes them feel a certain way. And so that was disheartening. And I wish I could have done more stuff on Honduras during that period because I think a lot of human rights violations happened and I just wasn't the journalist I was today. And now it's kind of different. Like Honduras has a new leader, still has lots of problems, but now like the focus of just lack of democracy is now pivoting more towards El Salvador. Now it's like, okay, well, I'm not going to play around anymore and like, oh, there's no audience for this. Like, let me not do it. Like, I have to be accountable, I guess, to like the people who follow me and the people in my community look to me for some guidance. You know, I'm going to keep covering these things, but I was constantly told that just Central America generally did not have an audience. And Trump changed that for 5 minutes. And then, I don't know, I think we're back. But yeah, that's kind of like the main thing, Honduras.
Sure, that makes sense. And yeah, I guess we'll see who wins the next election, and maybe the focus will be back there for better or for worse. Let's see. So then, yeah, next let's talk about a story that you're proud of, we usually talk about. But in this case, let's talk about the podcast. So I want to hear the story behind the podcast. If you could just tell us how you came to be involved in it, the process of doing it, kind of start to finish. And, specifically, I'm interested in what it's like, having a bilingual podcast, and then, a little bit about the reaction since it's been out for a little bit. So, yeah, tell us the story behind the story, kind of start to finish on the podcast.
Yeah, so this podcast came at a time when, the world was enamored by El Salvador's new president, Nayib Bukele. He's a maverick. His approval rating is high. He's fixing El Salvador. He's locking up the bad guys. He's selling Bitcoin. He's accelerated the narrative of El Salvador away from the violence. That alone is what makes people just happy. That Bukele is making El Salvador look better in the international light, whether that reflects a reality or not. So I was always a hater in terms of I was always critical of Nayib Bukele, and I saw a lot of these human rights violations just coming, and a lot of these attacks on democracy coming, because El Salvador has a history of this. It's he's not reinventing the wheel. He's looking at the old El Salvador dictator playbook. So I'd never relented with Nayib Bukele. I was always online. If I wasn't making my own little reel TikToks, I was contributing to someone else's report, even though I'm not working in a newsroom anymore. So I think folks caught wind of that. It's a testament to never shutting up on the internet. If you feel righteous and passionate about something, just never shut up about it. So I was one of the few voices who was very vocally critical about Nayib Bukele, and I'm vocally critical is because my family lived through the 70s in El Salvador, which was the lead up to the Civil War, and so I grew up with all these stories, and my mom would be like, "Oh yeah, this is what they would do in the 70s," when she's talking about people being locked up and being political prisoners. He's like, "Oh yeah, we grew up with this. We're going back to this," and so for me, it's also urgent because it's part of our collective memory that's being erased. So they approach me. And they're like, "Hey, we're doing a podcast in Spanish."
Who's they again? Sorry.
So Sonoro Media.
Gotcha.
Approached me. He's like, we're making a podcast with this Salvadoran journalist, Brian Avelar, and Brian Avelar is the host of the Spanish portion, and everything that's in the podcast is original reporting from his newsroom, Revista Factum in El Salvador, and his reporting himself. So he's narrating this in Spanish, and it's so good. If you speak Spanish, I tell folks to listen to his first, or if your parent only speaks Spanish, send them this. Excellent job. And they needed a voice for the English speaking part. They wanted to do it bilingually because they didn't want just this news to stay with the Spanish speaking world. And I'm just so grateful they thought of me. They wanted someone who can connect to Salvadorans because, I am one, and I talk about it, and I grew up around Salvadorans, but who can connect the dots between the past and the present, and can bridge the gap between El Salvador's politics and the esoteric nature of any country's politics to a diaspora group who is alienated from the home country. And so they approached me, and they thought I'd be a good fit. I got to meet Brian first to sort of see how we feel about each other, and they liked me, and they're like, "Okay, you're the perfect person to do the English version." And in the English version, I do bring a little bit of my life, and I talk about my mother losing her brothers in the war. There's a little bit of me in the English podcast, but it's really the excellent reporting that Brian Avelar did, and Revista Factum, and that Sonoro Media also helped with. And I don't want to give too many spoilers, but the stories that we talked about in the podcast had a huge impact on the journalist Brian Avelar, and he's no longer practicing journalism in El Salvador. So,
as in he's left, or as in he's doing other things? But is he still there, or is he?
He left the country. He left the country. He's no longer reporting in El Salvador, and I don't want to give it away too much, but it's had a lot of consequences for him, and so I'm just honored to sort of continue being in the tradition of my uncles and other people who have told truths of El Salvador and had to face consequences for it. And it all corroborated stuff that I was already following along. Before this podcast even happened, before I knew Brian, I remember that there was trolls, like Nayib Bukele, the president, sicked his trolls on Brian. And I remember speaking out against it. Before I even met Brian, I was just like, I was speaking out for him to not be persecuted by the Salvadoran government. So it was just perfect timing in terms of there wasn't a lot of Salvadoran journalists at the time, Salvadoran-American journalists at the time, who wanted to criticize Bukele. Like, people are really afraid to criticize Bukele because they don't want to alienate their family members, or they do feel that he's doing something positive for the country. And so there probably also wasn't a lot of Salvadoran Americans to pick from in the journalism world, because a lot of us just don't make it there. Salvadorans, if you go to the Pew Research Center, you'll see that Salvadorans have some of the lowest educational attainment among Hispanics in the country. So there's just not a lot of us. And so I was just glad that they went with me. If they would have gone with another Salvadoran, I would have been happy. But they saw the value that I can speak to Salvadoran Americans and that I can speak to the English-speaking public about this in a thoughtful way. And they saw that and they're like, we want that for our podcast. But really, like, it's all the labor that Revista Factum, Brian, and Sonoro did. And I came in towards the end of the process. I think they already had the script in Spanish, and once they were adapting it to English, I was brought in kind of later. So then we recorded in a couple different studios around DC and finding the right one. And the process took over a year.
Oh, wow.
Because there was updates. Like, it starts and centers around a mass grave that was found in El Salvador, I want to say in like the first year of President Bukele's term. And it's a case that I was following as well. And so I was already following the reporting that Brian was doing. So there was a lot of updates because Nayib Bukele has done so many. During the process of recording, Nayib Bukele was doing something else different. He was, the state of exception hadn't happened when we started this podcast, I think. And then the state of exception has become like a defining aspect of his presidency. The state of exception, for those that don't know, is basically El Salvador lives under some kind of martial law right now that's reserved only for temporary periods of unrest. And what that means is that civil rights are suspended and they can throw anyone in jail if they feel like it. The state of exception, it's supposed to be an exception. So it was supposed to be for 30 days and they just kept renewing it. And it's like been over 2 years with the state of exception now. And so it's the new normal. So things like that were unfolding, and the Bitcoin stuff was also unfolding in the background. And it's also a very tough material. Its viewer discretion is advised, and trigger warnings and all that, because we talk about death a lot. And it was very like emotionally draining just to like listen to these people's stories of losing their loved ones or fearing repression under this new government in El Salvador. And it really brought back a lot of feelings for me of my family members. And it was very emotionally draining, and in the sense that, like, carrying all this information, all this gruesome stuff, but it was also just like, this is the stuff that people need to hear about. It's not pretty. We got through it. The show finally premiered recently, and I'm used to video, and I feel like with video, the reactions are almost instant. And social media video, I'm talking about, I put out a story and people react to it in the moment. Whereas like a podcast, people need to sit down with it and I digest it a little more. And so people have listened to it and have, the reviews have started trickling in. And when I mean the reviews, I mean like my friends and people in my like orbit. And these are people who are well-read, well-informed. They have family in El Salvador, and they're like, I had no idea this was going on. Wow, I can't believe this has been going on this whole time. I can't believe I haven't heard more about Nayib Bukele's government outside of the good things. Like, he built a new library. He built some Bitcoin ATMs. They only hear those things. And so it was very jarring for people, especially some of the Salvadoran-American friends I have. They're like, okay, I wasn't convinced of this Bukele guy. He was very suspect. But now I'm like, oh, wow, I did not realize how deep this rabbit hole goes, and how dire it is in El Salvador right now, because it's called Humo because it's like all shrouded in smoke. Humo is smoke in Spanish.
Yeah, no, I actually didn't know that yet. I guess I haven't gotten far enough in the podcast yet. I've only listened to the first episode. You know, I wanted to come at this kind of as most of the audience will. But listening to that first episode, that my big question was if that, you know, in the first episode, they discover the mass grave after there's some calls to 911 and things like that. It's pretty heavy. And I guess my question was, is that mass grave case kind of the through line? Like, that is, if you listen through the podcast, that's the main through line, I'm guessing.
You know what? It's like the starting point. It's the starting point. We do follow up with that case throughout, but then there are other parallel cases. And when you think of a mass grave, you think about, like, it implicates a lot of loved ones and families, because if it's all the people who are in there, you know, they left some loved ones behind. And so it's also following up with those loved ones and how they feel that justice hasn't been served for them. But also, because of the nature of this regime, we also explore like parallel cases and other things that are happening around this case that is making the investigation difficult, that is making El Salvador more and more hostile to journalists. And so, yeah, it starts off with this case, and it's like the through line is this murder case, but it's like becomes so much more than that. And it's like, it's not the only murder or mass grave incident that happens. And it's also like, you know, mass graves in El Salvador, when you think of that, you think of the Civil War. And so it's jarring for a lot of people who felt that nothing can go wrong in this new El Salvador. A lot of people want to say that this is just a one-off. This is just a crazy guy who killed people, and he's a serial killer who worked in isolation. And what this podcast shows, it's just like, it's more than that. It's like there's this whole system that let this happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited to listen to more of it. Let me see, trying to think of what other questions I have about the podcast. I guess the one big question is it done and dusted? I mean, do you guys plan to revisit it? Do you plan to do more updates, or what happens from here?
I don't know. I guess that's up to Sonoro and Revista Factum and Brian if there's going to be more to it. There are more stories out there, and there's a lot of things are happening now that didn't make it into the podcast. Things are ongoing. We can gauge and see how the reaction is to this podcast. I feel like the people who have listened to it and who are going to listen to it, who need to listen to it, haven't all listened to it yet. And the reviews are still trickling in. You know, I'm still meeting people who have listened to it and have something to say about it. But I'd love to do another thing. And I love that it's bilingual. I know you asked about it earlier. I didn't really talk about it. But it's 8 episodes. But when you go on Spotify or Apple or wherever they have this, it looks like double that. So it looks like there's 16 episodes. So the first 8 are in Spanish, and the second 8 are the same episodes but in English, and those are mine. So if you look for the podcast Humo, Murder and Silence in El Salvador, and you were like, I don't speak Spanish, don't forget to scroll to the English part. I don't know of any other podcast that has been bilingual in this manner. Like, I've never had to scroll down to like a different language, but I love that we're doing it. I love that we're doing it. And I think for a lot of these stories, especially with like Latin America, it's great to have the same information in 2 languages, because oftentimes when I'm doing journalism in the US in English speaking media, I can't share it with my family. Like, not everyone has the same level of English fluidity. So to have a final product being like, hey, you can fully listen to it in Spanish or fully listen to it in English, means that it's reaching more ears. People can engage with it. And I know some people in my circles who, like, you know, they're Salvadoran-American, they're English speaking primarily, like, and they listen to the podcast in English, and then they'll send it to their parent who is Spanish dominant, and their parent will listen to it in the Spanish version, and then they could talk about it. I feel like that's the power of the bilingualness. And whatever I do, again, it's just like, okay, you know what? I need to do more bilingual stuff. Because people always tell me, it's like, Daniel, I love your content, but can you do more in Spanish? I'm like, I would love to, but like, it's time, energy, money I don't have.
Sure. Yeah.
But seeing the reaction to this is like, okay, I want more of these opportunities where people can toggle between the languages, and it's just more accessible.
Yeah, no, it's very cool that it's in both languages. And I can't think of other podcasts I know of other Spanish language podcasts, but yeah, I can't think of ones that are both. Okay, cool. And I'd be curious to know which is getting more listenership, the English or the Spanish, but I'm guessing El Sonoro holds the keys to the account and is probably the ones tracking that.
Yeah, I want to know that too.
So that's I think it for the podcast, because people should just go out and listen to them themselves, and I'll post a link to that in our podcast description. So yeah, pressing on. Next up is the lightning round. It's faster paced questions. Do you feel ready?
Yes.
So first up is a publication that reports on subject matter or geography that you're interested in, that does a particularly good job, you think, but maybe not everybody knows about it.
Yes, I want to shout out Atmos. It's a climate magazine, Atmos magazine, and the editor at large is Yesenia Funes, who's coincidentally Salvadoran-American, but that's not why I picked it. But they did a really cool article called "How El Salvador's Iron Fist Regime is Quashing Environmental Resistance," and I'm like, yes, this is the kind of coverage we need, because so much is going on with El Salvador. We've talked about its issues with democracy, but climate justice activists in El Salvador are getting squashed left and right. El Salvador is the first country in the world to ban mining, and we're seeing a lot of backsliding from that. And so Atmos magazine does a lot of great climate stuff. Yesenia Funes there. She also recently did a piece exploring cobalt mining in the Congo, which I've been hearing a lot about, and how it's fueling a lot of bad things there. But yeah, I just loved that she did an article talking about all of the things going on in El Salvador and how it's affecting the environment. And it's through the lens of like community activists and people in El Salvador who don't really get the mic.
Cool. Yeah, no, I follow Atmos on Instagram. I want to say they have a very well produced account, but I hadn't clocked that story about El Salvador. I'll have to look for it. And then next is a publication that's journalistic in nature, but something you look at more just for fun.
I've been listening to a lot of the podcast Songs That Explain the 90s.
Sure, yeah.
Just nostalgic. I love, I was a radio DJ. I always said that if El Salvador wasn't on fire, I would have been a music journalist. So I've been listening to that podcast a lot for fun. If I just need something to they'll tell me the story of Smells Like Teen Spirit, or they'll tell you the story about why Tupac was such a big figure. And I just think that pop culture is important. I'm not a pop culture reporter, but I feel that my generation, we had a whole lot of VH1. I love the 90s, and people contextualizing why pop culture matters and how it affects culture. And I feel like now in the internet, we don't have a monoculture anymore, which is a good thing. But I feel that just things are just much more decentralized. And I think about how are we going to talk about this time period? But I love Songs That Explain the 90s. That's just been my fun thing.
Cool. That's a good answer. And then, what's the best journalistic article piece? Again, whatever medium you've consumed recently.
There's this podcast called Locatora Radio, and they did a little piece with, I don't know what the guy's name is, but those the protests that are happening in on campuses in support of Palestine.
Right. There
There was a dad who went viral. His name was Lázaro Aguirre. I'm saying it right. But he was at, I think, USC, and he was just this dad who is immigrant Latino dad who is supporting their children at the march. And they recently did an episode where they interviewed him. They talked about why it's important to support his son. It was just very heartwarming to see an intergenerational sort of aspect to this conflict because everyone's talking about like it's the young people versus the old people, and it's like that's not how it is. And they gave this Latino dad some love and talked about how his solidarity with Gaza is, you know, shaped by his experiences. And I think a lot of people do think that it's like, okay, it's like millennials and Gen Z versus like boomers and Gen X or whatever. But I don't think it's generational. Like I think about my parents, my mom, she's a boomer, but like she lived through revolution in El Salvador. So like that informs our perspectives on solidarity. So I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed that interview because it just shows that it's solidarity is not just a young person's movement, and it's, you know, our immigrant parents can be a part of it too.
Cool. And is that the name was Locatora? Was that right? And is that English language, Spanish language?
Yeah, it's in English, but it's two Latinas, and it's called Locatora Radio.
Like crazy female bull, or what is Tora translated?
Like loca, like crazy, and Tora. So someone who's an announcer in radio in Spanish is called a locutor.
Gotcha.
And so they added their own spin on it. I think it's a really cute name, but it's in English, and it's two Latinas, Diosa Femme and Mala Munoz, in LA, and you know, they got the interview of the viral guy, and that kind of was heartwarming.
Is there any particular subject matter you geek out about that isn't related to your job?
Music. I love a lot of independent music. My partner's a musician, and so I just love, especially right now, it's like a lot of nostalgic stuff. Like I mentioned, like the 90s podcasts and stuff like that. I'm just really into music right now. I'm really getting over streaming, and so like I'm like, okay, you know, I want to support, you know, new independent artists, and I want to like own the things, because living out of suitcases in my 20s and just, you know, the rise of streaming, like I don't have physical music anymore, and I'm just like, so I've been rebuilding like my tape, vinyl, CD collection slowly and discovering new music. For me, that's been kind of my release to all of this stressful news stuff. I don't know if that answers your question.
Sure. Yeah, no, that does. And then the next question is, if you had to trade places with one journalist living or dead and you would have their career, who would it be?
This is hard because I don't envy anyone's career. Either they do something that like doesn't align with my values, or I don't envy what they have to go through as a journalist and being visible and getting criticism.
Sure.
So I'll say Juan Gonzalez. He's the co-host along with Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! He's a bit low-key. He's not like a celebrity journalist that's like on CNN every day, but he's someone who's had like longevity and has also really kept their values. I feel like there's always this sense that you were always told that we're going to become more conservative as we age. At least that's what I was told as a child. And so his body of work is also just like something that like I would be proud of if I did that. Like he's written a few books about like imperialism in Latin America, advocating for the survivors of 9/11. But what really sticks out to me is that like he was there reporting on Central America as it happened, and from like a progressive voice. It wasn't just the usual like kill the communists because Reagan said so. And I say him because he was in a documentary that like, okay, like I was a little jealous that he was in this documentary, but like obviously like I wasn't alive to cover the Salvador War. I was a toddler at best. So I was streaming this docuseries because like I said, I really love music despite all this like war stuff. I love music. And so I was watching a docuseries about the Puerto Rican boy group Menudo. I don't know what streaming channel it was, but it's called Menudo Forever Young. So I'm watching it. I'm just like, I don't think I'm going to come up to politics. I just want to know what like Ricky Martin and the kids of Menudo were up to. And then they do an episode where they go to El Salvador. I'm like, what? Why are we in this? And then they go to El Salvador and they talk about how Menudo came to El Salvador and it caused a temporary ceasefire just for the concert. So it was like, wow, the power of pop music. Like they can do a ceasefire for like 5 minutes. And guess who was contextualizing the war for everybody? It was Juan Gonzalez. Juan Gonzalez was talking about, and it's just like, Juan Gonzalez is someone I would trust to talk about the war to. There's a lot of people who are around them that I don't trust. So he was in the Menudo documentary talking about the war and contextualizing everything. I was like, oh, I wish I could do something like that. And I don't have a lot of those moments. I feel like sometimes I'm just kind of like, oh, this news anchor is making me cringe. It was cool.
Cool. Yeah, no, Juan Gonzalez is a good choice. What is one thing most people don't know about you?
So a lot of people don't know that, this is random, I did an online degree in Spain, and it was for IE University, Instituto de Empresa, and I guess it's a business school. I wanted to go for digital journalism, and then I deferred a year because I couldn't pay for it. And then they ended up canceling the digital journalism program, and they only had like corporate communication or marketing or something. I was like, I already paid a deposit. But the reason I had to do an online degree in Spain was because I defaulted on my student loans. Like, I couldn't get a job after I graduated into a recession, and I went to Korea and I made a little money, but I defaulted on my student loans. So like, I couldn't go to school in the United States. I couldn't get a master's in the United States. I wouldn't get financial aid because I had defaulted, and there was all these, Obama era programs to help, but I just couldn't get it. So I did an online degree in 2015 with a Spanish university, and it sounds like really fancy, and they gave me this diploma that is like mentions the King of Spain, like the way our diplomas in California like mention like the governor, theirs mentions the king. So it's like this really fancy thing, and it really wasn't. Like, it was like an online degree before people were doing online degrees. And I remember feeling really self-conscious, like people are not going to take this seriously because it's an online degree. And then we became much more of a hybrid world later, not too long later. And I don't feel quite silly. I feel like maybe I was like ahead of the curve. But like, it's kind of funny too, because it's like, as we're seeing like journalism become dismantled, a lot of us are going into these careers. So I guess in some ways it was fortune telling. In a lot of ways, that's just where the industry was going, and where a lot of us communication workers end up. And before I became a journalist, I was in the communications field and, social media manager or what have you. And there was a lot of former journalists in there, and like, it's such a pipeline. So it's kind of been the fallback. And like I said, immigrant parents, like I needed to come up with something that like got me a job. I journalism so much is like very grassroots, doesn't pay much, or like you need to know somebody. So yeah, I did this online degree that people are like, why did you do it in some other country? Why was it online? And it's just like, you don't seem like a marketer type. You don't seem like the corporate type. And it's just kind of like, well, they cut digital journalism, and I didn't want to lose the deposit I made on that. And here I am. Sure. And it's weird. And it's just like, I kind of block it out of my mind. Not that it was like bad or anything. It's just, it's not where my heart is. Like, I really wanted to do a journalism program. And now I'm just kind of like,
sure,
whatever. Like, I've been practicing it. Like, I don't need the degree to be like, you're a journalist.
Right.
But,
right.
It would have been nice.
Okay. Interesting. What's your most embarrassing journalism related story, if you have one?
Yeah, it's embarrassing in a way, but it's also like not embarrassing because I didn't get credited. So when I started Al Jazeera, I said I was not a reporter. I was just the social media scheduler.
Right.
I scheduled everyone else's stories. So like, I didn't contribute editorially. I wasn't allowed to. And so by the time Kids in Cages, Trump happened, they realized I had an expertise, and that opened the floodgates of opportunity to be like, hey, we want to hear your analysis, and we want to use your analysis. And so one of the first things I did for Al Jazeera was I contributed to a video, and it got millions of views. And I think it's called The History of U.S. Imperialism in Central America. It's a beautifully done overview. And I contributed my knowledge. I included some family stuff in there. I even provided contacts for the sources that were interviewed in there. And I saw this as my opportunity to like, okay, I'm gonna get in the newsroom, I'm gonna contribute to a report. I don't care if they credit me or not. I just want to do this work. And so because I wasn't part of the editorial team or anything, like I didn't have final say, I didn't see things, they took my notes and ran with them and did their own piece. So I wasn't like consulted like I was a team member because I wasn't there yet. And I gave all my notes and whatever, and I watched the final video, and, you know, they're talking about imperialism in Central America, and they're showing a lot of maps of Central America. And all the maps of Central America that show the whole region were missing a crucial border. They were missing Belize. So Belize is on the side of Guatemala and Mexico.
Right.
And the map just had a bigger Guatemala instead of a Belize. And if you don't know about Central American politics, is that Guatemala is always trying to annex Belize.
Huh.
The only reason they don't annex Belize, in my opinion, is because they don't want smoke from the UK, because Belize is a Commonwealth nation. We don't want another Falklands Island situation. But Belize and Guatemala have land disputes, and it's really bad. It got to the point where, like, the Ministry of Tourism from Belize was commenting on the video.
Oh, wow.
And the Ministry of Belize was like, can you please re-edit this? Can you change this? This is really bad. And it had millions of views, and, like, I felt embarrassed and terrible because of, like, I wanted to be like, hey, I worked on this. But at the end of the day, I wasn't credited. There wasn't even a thank you credit, and I could be salty about that. But, you know, on subsequent pieces, I was credited, but, like, I felt embarrassment because I've never had a Central American government, like, call out any of my pieces yet.
Sure.
And a lot of people overlook Belize, which is, like, a problem in terms of Central America. And so I feel a little less embarrassed that I wasn't included, and I'm not mad about it. It was a good piece aside from that. And it was a stepping stone for me. But, yeah, like, I would have caught that if I would have seen a version of it before it went out, because, like, so much of my life is just looking at maps of Central America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But no, that's I mean, I guess funny to me that just somebody would leave an entire country off the map. But, you know, I'm familiar with how, you know, people pull maps of, like, China, and they might or might not include Taiwan, and they might not notice, and it can really turn into a huge deal. Or they could pull a map that shows that China controls the entire South China Sea, or they could not. And again, you know, similar sort of thing.
Yep.
So that's interesting. Okay. And then what is the coolest, weirdest, strangest, most surreal, in a good or a bad way, situation or place your job has taken you to? So I like to call this a pinch me, I can't believe this is my job or my life moment.
I got to travel to Guatemala in 2022, and I have been to Guatemala, like the touristy parts, as a child. A lot of Salvadorans, especially, like, people who are, like, coming from the U.S. or middle class, like, Guatemala is like a vacation destination. But I got to go to Guatemala under very different circumstances. So in 2019, I did a piece called Why Are Indigenous Children Dying at the Border with the Mayan League. And we talked about forced migration. And I talked about this already. But this piece was so important because I found through that piece the Mayan League. And I just started following them and becoming closer with them because they're doing some very important work, making sure that indigenous people are recognized in this immigration debate, that they're getting resources, that they're getting especially language resources, and that they're also talking about the country conditions. And so I became really close with the Mayan League. After I left AJ Plus, we stayed in contact, and I started partnering them with small projects like, you know, helping virtual events, helping film little testimonies here and there, and just, you know, giving my journalistic knowledge as much as I could. And then this relationship, you know, culminated in going to Guatemala in 2022, and I got to go to Maya Quechua lands. Maya Quechua, they're one of the many indigenous nations in Guatemala, and for me, it was just the most humbling experience because I'm so used to Spanish dominant parts of Central America. I'm so used to being, like, you know, fluent and everything, and you know, I needed to have a translator that spoke Maya Quechua, and I had never been in a part of Central America where indigenous languages were just spoken everywhere. In El Salvador, a lot of that stuff has been repressed and erased, and it still exists, but in Guatemala, it's a whole different scenario. But what was really like about this, it was just so humbling to me that I can be there, but also that these testimonies that we took, they weren't for a news story, they weren't for a little piece of content. These were testimonies that were like later taken to the UN and, you know, to indigenous forums to act as testimonies to prove Guatemala is repressing its indigenous people. So like for me, it wasn't just journalism, it was part of this bigger work. And I have, you know, through journalism, I established a relationship with this organization, and they're doing very big picture work about getting indigenous rights recognized, especially for Maya peoples. And we've taken a lot from Maya peoples just as like a society, like, you know, just there's so much science, culture, agriculture. You know, we talk about the Mayan civilization in the past, like it ended, and none of that's true. And just to be able to do that work with the Mayan League and to have that partnership and to just have a little bit of influence in just the region getting better and treating people better is just the most humbling experience, more than any story or anything where like I had to go back and forth with an editor or whatnot. It's just, these are things that need to happen. These are things that need to happen. And I'm so happy that, you know, in this post-journalistic world, not post-journalistic, but I can still use my skills as a journalist to help others and to contribute to the world. It's not just, you know, about the bylines all the time.
Yeah, that's cool. I was in Guatemala last year for a training with people from all over the region and learned a little bit about how dominant Mayan culture was there. And yeah, I had no idea. I mean, like, I have a lot to learn about Central America, obviously, but it was cool. Let's see, 2 questions left. What is your favorite film, book, TV, or other media property about journalists, and why? It can be fiction, nonfiction, something at least tangentially related to journalists.
Okay, so I know I already said Juan Gonzalez, and I'm going to say Juan Gonzalez again. He co-authored a book with someone, I think Joseph Torres, and I hope I get that right. The book is called News for All the People: The Epic Story of Race in American Media. And I read this in my last year in college, and the book is basically about the history that you never hear about in journalism, like that people of color throughout U.S. history made their own media, and they were often suppressed violently for it. And to me, it kind of reminded me like, oh, like this is the shoulder that I stand on as a journalist. It's the shoulders that I think we all stand on, no matter what our race is as journalists. In America, this has been part of what has built journalism. And it also reminded me there's always going to be like non-mainstream media going against the grain of corporate interests. And it's important to remember that as we're in this moment in the industry where it feels like it's crumbling around us, like Black Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, they had their own publications, they had their own news media, and it was something that was violently suppressed at times. And for me, like, I had never contextualized myself in American media, or like, what does it mean to come from a marginalized background like Salvadorans and make media in this country. And I think now this book came out in 2011, and I feel now where we're having these discussions about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're having these discussions about diversity in the newsroom, we're having these discussions about taking things out of the curriculum because they make America look bad. This book, I feel, is just still relevant, and definitely one of the things that like kept me going in terms of like, okay, you know, the conditions for journalism aren't always going to be favorable, but like you need to find a way to tell some of these stories.
Yeah, cool. And the last question is, qualifications aside, if you couldn't be a journalist, what job would you do?
I would, and this is maybe just sounds ridiculous, but I would like own a record store if I could.
Sure.
Where I could just listen to music, impose my tastes, maybe, I don't know, but I've just been on this kick recently. Yeah, I'm thinking about like retirement. Like it feels like, well, if I collect these records, you know, it's not like I'm just, you know, being wasteful. Like I could eventually, you know, sell the ones I don't want, or if I build a big enough collection. But I'm just thinking about like retirement. Like what's something that I'd like to do where I could just, you know, listen to music and chill out a little bit. And I know running a store and a business is not all that, but I've just been, fantasizing what's my like off the grid job. And I mean off the grid, I just mean off the internet. I don't mean like out in nature. But so I just wanted to spend my old days just being like a cranky record store guy who like gives you unsolicited recommendations. Maybe like that would be the dream.
Yeah. No, I get a fair few of answers in that vein, not record store, but things that I would just make pizza, and we would make two kinds of pizza. And it's like people who have very demanding jobs have these kind of fantasies of like, I'm going to do this very simple thing and it'll be very chill, and the opposite of like the frenetic craziness of my current job. So cool. Yeah. Record store is a good answer. So that's all the questions. So I'll just wrap up by saying thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been great, and it's been a pleasure.
That's our show. Thanks for listening to my conversation with Daniel Alvarenga, a freelance journalist and host of the podcast Humo, Murder and Silence in El Salvador. I'll post links to some of the things Daniel talked about in the podcast description and also on our show page, foreignpod.podbean.com. If you like this episode of Foreign Correspondence, please subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts, and give it a rating. Beyond that, it would be a huge help if you also write out a review saying what you think about the show. It helps get the podcast more attention. Follow or tweet at me on X at @foreignpod. On Facebook, our page is facebook.com/foreignpod. Above all, if you know someone who might like the podcast, please recommend it to them. The show is produced and edited by me. Our music is a track called Love Chances by Mackay Beats. There's more information on that in the podcast description and on our show page. Please look out for my next episode to drop in August. Until then, I'm Jake Spring, and this is Foreign Correspondence.